Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my first cheat sheet series as part of the Euro 2024 fantasy campaign. We're looking at the midfielders, obviously the most interesting position, given that you actually have more choices to go with. The forwards will be coming next, and then defenders and goalkeepers will be done as a tandem, because we're looking mostly at things like clean sheet odds, and then also, slight intangibles like if you're an attacking fullback, etc., or if you can play out of position. With the midfields here, and if you've never watched the cheat sheet series before, the whole idea is we're looking at players and their sort of efficiency at certain price points. So here, of course, we have some players that are very expensive, going up to 9.5 million, like a De Bruyne or a Bellingham. At the same time, though, you have some really cheap players that can actually plug an enabling role for your team. And we start here with the sort of cheaper players, looking at their price points and looking at whether we think they're actually going to be effective for the purposes of Euro Fantasy. At the same time, as I said, if you've watched my chip strategy video, you'll notice that people will have different chip strategies. You might be going for a midfielder in your draft that will only serve a purpose for match day 1, or you might be looking at players who have purposes for match days 2 and 3, depending on what your chip strategy is. What I've tried to do is also illustrate for each team, how strong or how weak their specific games are in match day 1 to match day 2 and match day 3. So you can see, of course, the sort of difficulty in terms of the attacking strength, and also, of course, the corresponding defensive strength of the opponents as well within that fixture, just being encapsulated there with my fixture difficulty ranking. If we just start quickly with the fixture difficulty ranking, this is done for attackers, really. And of course, you can see teams like England, Portugal, Germany, France, Belgium, they're at the top. Spain, Netherlands, a tier below. And I think for Spain, that's mostly because their group is a little bit tougher, right? They have Italy, they have unfortunately Croatia as well, who, despite not necessarily being an attacking juggernaut, they're definitely a reasonably good defensive team. And of course, when you compare to some of the other groups that are on display, like the Belgium group, for example, you can kind of get an understanding why we tier Belgium so highly within the group stages. However, of course, I do think that the best teams potentially, arguably, heading towards this tournament, which are also backed by the odds in general for this tournament, are teams like England, Portugal, Germany, and France. Those would probably be my top 4 on predictions right now. I am Spanish, of course, so hopefully we can pull out a great run, just like Italy did last time around. Italy, not too far behind Netherlands as well. Denmark, we've also consistently seen that they've actually been a very, very good international team. Pretty well defended. And when you see, for example, how they got knocked out versus England last time round, how they've also gotten a lot of draws in previous international campaigns, you know that they're a pretty robust team. Potentially not that threatening on attack, but still very solid, very much like Croatia, where you're not expecting Denmark or Croatia to get completely rolled over. And then obviously it gets a little bit worse. Unfortunately, teams like Ukraine actually have a pretty good group. So I would say they're definitely in that sort of medium tier if you're looking for a differential, a talisman potentially from Ukraine, who also has good fixtures, like, for example, in match day 1 or match day 2, of course. When you're talking about a team like Croatia, it's more about targeting, for example, that Albania game if you're going for, let's say, a chip strategy on match day 2. Looking at Switzerland, maybe looking at Turkey as well. These are teams where I think, fortunately, when you look at match day 1, match day 2, for, let's say, Switzerland, and then match day 1, match day 3 for Turkey, that's where they actually have a decent shout of getting a pretty good result. So when you're looking at investing into some potential players from these teams, you've got better chances there. Unfortunately, of course, we have some teams like Hungary, maybe even Georgia, for example, where you have some talismans there like Szoboszlai and Kvaratskhelia, who actually could be quite interesting. But you also have to take into account how weak their teams might be. Although, of course, the whole idea of being a talisman, I suppose, is when you have international games like this, those players can still be extremely well producing in terms of their goals and assists, potential man of the matches as well, if they actually steal, let's say, a surprise win or a surprise upset. But let's quickly go on towards the midfielders, and we can start with the budget midfielders. Here we actually have an insanely priced midfielder in Jorginho. I probably actually neglected the value of Jorginho within my matchday 1 draft. I actually do think that he probably could trickle into my team. This is the penalty taker for Italy, someone who'll play 90 minutes. Man of the match potential probably not significantly high when you look at, of course, the underlying stats that he has, and even just the sort of actualized stats in terms of goals and assists for both national team and, of course, with Arsenal. Unfortunately, they're not very great, right? We're looking at a defensive mid here, someone who's probably not going to be that involved. The best chance of sort of getting involved is getting a penalty, which is very possible, right, considering the weakness of the opponent. And then also just in general, for example, decent clean sheet odds here for the match versus Albania. But once again, going back to the point, at 5 million, because a lot of the other midfielders are around 6 million, 6.5 million, and we look at them as enablers as well. Jorginho being at 5 million is, in my opinion, an absolute steal, unless you want to let's say, triple up on Italy in a different way. So, for example, if you're going for Chiesa, totally understandable, and you're backing up, let's say, double Italian defense versus Albania, that also makes sense too. But here you have an option that can actually just perform the best enabling role, I think, in the tournament. The next territory is the 6 million players. And I think this is an interesting one where you have two players here who could play expansive roles in this tournament, or more expanded roles compared to what we've previously expected from them in the past. Arda Güler is someone who actually has played for Real Madrid this season. He's scored 6 goals so far in effectively 370 minutes. So insane returns as a super sub, or even someone who started games when Real Madrid won the league. As a Real Madrid fan, I do think he's extremely talented. That's obviously why we purchased him. But when you look, for example, at his performances, even before he joined Real Madrid, very consistent sort of attacking output when he was playing in the Turkish league. And at the same time, I do think that his role within the national team will probably be a little bit better than some people expect. Of course, when you look at his historic appearances, obviously he came on as a super sub at times, sometimes also a player who'd be subbed off earlier. I do think that, of course, he's taken a stride this year, despite actually just being a role player for Real Madrid at this moment in time. But I think with Turkey, you have a chance here, particularly, as I said, with the fixtures being pretty decent, particularly, for example, in match day 1, that he could be a very interesting punt for the type of manager who's going for a chip strategy around that, right? So Güler, I think, is an interesting price spot. You don't really have too many attacking players at the 6 million to 6.5 million category. A lot of these players are defensive mids. A lot of these players might have reduced minutes or have really tough fixtures. Güler is somewhere in the between, where I think he's an attacking player, as I said, which is a big differential to some of the other players in this price point, but he's also someone who could very well play more minutes than we expect with his Turkish team. With Vitinha, I do think he will actually play for the Portuguese national team. He will play a deeper role compared to as he does with PSG. However, I do think at 6 million, when you look at the price points of all the Portuguese players, they're actually really adequately priced. I think he might be the one where you can argue that he's a little bit of a steal. If you also sort of take into account the fact that Portugal actually have really good fixtures because their group is really easy, if we're being honest, the idea that you can actually invest into a Portuguese midfielder at a pretty cheap price is not too bad for me. What I would look out for, of course, is just looking out for the friendlies to make sure that he's nailed, because I don't think he's 100% going to start, but I think we have a pretty high chance of seeing Vitinha start within this Portuguese team. Of course, as I said, you probably want to prefer going for a triple up potentially of Portugal, and that might be, for example, let's say going for Cristiano, going for Bruno Fernandes, going for Adalo or Cancelo, and that might make more sense. But I don't think I'd neglect the idea of Vitinha, because if you are looking for someone to just fill in a gap for your team, 6 million, not too bad. With Granit Xhaka here, unfortunately, of course, you're looking at a controller, right, and someone who probably isn't going to get man of the match. And I also think that Switzerland are probably a little bit of a weaker team that they have been in previous sort of campaigns, particularly internationally, where we've seen great upsets sort of pulled out by Switzerland. So from that sort of perspective, I do think that Switzerland is in a squad that maybe we should historically underrate, but they do have a pretty tough campaign, I think, ahead of them. The group is actually not too bad, because if you look at the Belgian group, I do think that you're expecting them potentially to come out second. However, I just think that they are a pretty weak team right now as it stands. And of course, Granit Xhaka, his value most likely is going to come from ball recovery. So given that you have a little bit more upside from some more advanced players like Arda Güler, I just think it's probably not advisable to go Granit Xhaka right now. At the same time, when we talk about Swiss players and we move on to the next price bracket here in the 6.5 million bracket, Shaqiri is an interesting one, right? Because of course, this is the main man for Switzerland from many campaigns past. However, I think he's at 32 right now, playing in the MLS, had a pretty poor year. When you look at some of his recent sort of outgoings for the Swiss national team, it has been a little bit worse, right? Less minutes. We do expect him to be on penalties probably, but I'm not so sure that he's going to be one of the better assets of this tournament, because, as I said, he has unfortunately regressed a little bit as a player, and that's something that we don't really like to see with Çalhanoğlu. Yes, of course, if you talk about, let's say, his role for the national team, he's probably going to be a defensive mid. Same with Rodri as well, arguably, although he's going to be playing in a double pivot and probably not going to be someone who's just necessarily sitting in front of the defense. At least that's what I expect, because we've sort of been fielding a 4-2-3-1 with the Spanish national team so far. So I do think that Rodri is interesting, because him and Çalhanoğlu are both players who are going to be penalty takers. When you look at Rodri as well, some of the best ball recovery stats, and I think that makes him a complete tier ahead of someone like Granit Xhaka. At the same time, too, I think he is actually the best player for the Spanish national team. And of course, when you look at, for example, the peers that he has, this is a slightly weaker Spanish squad. I do think that the man of the match potential is actually rather high with a player like Rodri, particularly since he's also on penalties. And we saw, for example, how useful that could be within the sort of friendly versus Brazil. And that's it, right? Ball recoveries will hopefully supplement a lot of what people don't like about Rodri in terms of his defensive positioning. With Çalhanoğlu, I think that you're looking at a player here who can play multiple roles, right? A controller once again as well, but also a very creative player when you look at his domestic play with Inter Milan. So I do think that he's a little bit of a sleeper. We can kind of see what Turkey are going to be lining up with in the friendlies and get an assessment of that. What I do like about Arda Güler is that he's very cheap, but of course his minutes aren't necessarily as guaranteed as someone like Çalhanoğlu. Neither does he have the intangibles of penalties. So I do think I'd still rate Çalhanoğlu as a green asset, and maybe someone like Güler, as we go back to him, could be someone that could actually rise in terms of my estimations before the tournament starts, depending on how nailed I think he becomes for this Turkish team. As far as the sort of other 6.5 million players, McTominay for me is definitely not someone I would class as a controller, right? He's almost an attacker, I would say, maybe even a forward for Scotland at times when you've watched the qualifying campaign. And it's very clear that that's intentional. It's not like McTominay was suddenly jamming goals and that was not part of the plan. I think it's very clear that he is sort of used in a very attacking manner, much more so than you see him when he plays for Man United, where sometimes, of course, he does play a holding role as part of the pivot, as opposed to just someone who almost was like Weghorst in the previous season and sort of filling that sort of role for Man United. With Scotland, I think it's very clear that he is allowed to sort of play an expansive role, and I think that I saw that as well firsthand when he was terrorizing the Spanish national team, as well as getting a disallowed goal. The only thing I don't like about McTominay, unfortunately, is just that the way the fixtures are laid out for the Scottish team, because they're facing their toughest opponent within the group first, and that sort of makes it very tough to sort of squeeze McTominay into your draft. If anything, I think McTominay is someone that you probably want to be bringing in maybe later on. Maybe, let's say, if you're looking at the Scottish fixtures, you could be thinking about playing him versus Switzerland and Hungary, so bringing him in match day 2 as a differential, because I do think that he's going to play a very consistent role for this team. But as I said, I just don't like how the fixtures kind of get better and better, which just means that he's less of an option for match day 1. And because you do have free transfers anyways, if you're not planning to use your chips, you can obviously just use your free transfers to get to McTominay, as I mentioned. Or, of course, if you're using chips, it's less important for you, and you can just think about McTominay later on in the tournament. As far as Kroos, Kimmich, Rice, these are all players where, of course, I think Rice could arguably play a slightly more advanced role as well. And given that I think this English team are so dominant and probably will be so dominant, it's nice, of course, to have him where he can obviously play a part too. And when you look at, for example, Kroos and Kimmich, similar sort of mentions where I have to say these are more controllers. These are players who will get access to some set pieces as well, potentially. But is there that much value for a 6.5 midfielder? In my opinion, not so much, right? The goal scoring odds for all these players, unfortunately, are going to be very low. Assist odds might be decent, of course, due to the set pieces that they might be granted. However, I just think that even though there's a little bit of ball recovery potential here with Kroos, Kimmich, and Rice, I would still probably neglect these players at this moment in time, and I just see them as differentials. If you really like the idea that teams like England, Portugal, Germany, and France are the most dominant teams in the tournament, and you want to fill your team up with the best teams and the best players from those teams, I think that could make sense, right, if you're trying to just create drafts with very strong teams. But I wouldn't necessarily neglect some of the teams that we classify as slightly weaker here, because they do have potentially, in my opinion, some more valuable players, and that's simply why you see these players in the orange tier. As far as the next tier, looking at the 7 million players, we have some interesting points to mention, right? Szoboszlai, I think, is an interesting one because I think he is the main man for Hungary, and he actually probably does well on all sorts of metrics for this team. He plays more advanced for Hungary as well. He's on penalties. He's also someone who is more than likely going to get the man of the match if Hungary are to do well within this tournament. So I think he has all the intangibles from that perspective, and the ball recovery numbers are insane for Szoboszlai as well. If you look at domestic numbers, if you look at national team numbers as well for the qualifying campaign, he actually has just very, very good metrics across the board. So I think from that perspective, I'm quite intrigued to see Szoboszlai as a pick. I do think that he is the most nailed player, but of course you can argue that the ceiling is a little bit lower, right? As I said, with the sort of looking at the attacking strengths of teams, unfortunately, we're not expecting that much from Hungary. So the idea that, let's say, Szoboszlai is going to completely create an upset here in match day 1 is going to be a little bit of a far shout. However, they are against Switzerland, and that is one of the weaker teams in the group, considering that you're not sort of taking into account Germany at this moment in time. As far as Gundogan, who I think what's nice about Gundogan is that you're looking at a player who should be nailed to start. However, his minutes could arguably be a little bit worse than anticipated, right? The German national team has a pretty deep bench. At the same time, we've seen, of course, that Nagelsmann is pretty happy to substitute players early as well. So when you look at, for example, previous matches, Gundogan's minutes aren't perfect. And so you can see players like Führer come in, you can see Muller come in potentially as well. Füllkrug as well can sort of replace the striker too. And that might mean that someone like Kai Havertz potentially could even drop back, or of course just becomes a like-for-like sub. So that for me is a little bit of a dampener. However, I do think that there is a pretty high chance that Gundogan is on penalties, which is why I do like him a lot. And given the fact that the fixtures are sort of laid out in a pretty nice way for Germany because of their group, I do like Gundogan as a pick. Of course, I think a lot of people will be sort of thinking about the idea of that 7 million price point for Germany, right? Whether you go for Kai Havertz or whether you go for Gundogan. One thing I'll say about the German national team is that they are the team that will actually start this tournament out, right, with their game versus Scotland. And so if you are actually sitting around close to the deadline, you will get the German national team lineup. So if you're concerned about, for example, how deep Gundogan might play, whether he plays as a 10, whether Sane might play, things like that, just look out for the lineup before the tournament starts, and you can change your draft around that. Personally, for me, if I really had to choose between Gundogan and Havertz, I would actually say I prefer Havertz. And then, of course, I think there's another dilemma that a lot of people have in the 9 million position, in the midfield position versus the forward position, which is Lukaku as well. So Bruno Fernandes, for example, someone at 9 million versus someone like Lukaku, who's also at 9 million, is a conundrum that a lot of managers need to think about. However, I still think that I'm probably likely to go Havertz and Fernandes at this moment in time, because I think his minutes are probably going to be slightly better potentially than Gundogan's, and that could have a significant impact on, how you evaluate these players and these pairs. Xavi Simons is someone that I've also, had in my matchday 1 draft. I do completely understand that a lot of Dutch fans think that he's not shown anything for the national team, and I think that's totally fine. But at the same time, I think that these sort of big international tournaments are usually turning points for a lot of players' careers. And at the same time, I think he is still part of that starting 11. I do expect him to start for this Dutch team. So when I consider, for example, the Netherlands team and, for example, their group as well, the fact that they're actually playing versus Poland match day 1, I don't really like the idea that Simons is a complete no-go. Yes, maybe it's a bit of a punt, but at 7 million, I think you are allowed that sort of potential. And of course, even though we have some safer options here too, I think that the fixture allows for Simons to be quite an interesting asset that a lot of people can consider going for, because with the Dutch team, you can actually have some cheap potential options, right? For example, someone like Verbruggen is very cheap. And if you want to target match day 1 specifically, I do think Netherlands serves that favor for you really well. Now, if you, let's say, are not planning to use a chip for match day 2, the idea of going for a Dutch player is not so interesting, right? Because you have France in match day 2. So that's something to think about. It's more about what kind of strategy you're going for and whether someone like Simons is a bit more interesting for you. Now, if you plan to use less chips in the group stage, it obviously makes more sense to go with teams that have overall more favorable fixtures. So that therefore, let's say a Doku would be better, a Gundogan would be better as well. With Barella, it's a similar situation with Simons, where I think, once again, an amazing match day 1 fixture. Yes, of course, he's more of a centre mid. He's not exactly a 10, although at times you can see him play advanced positions. Although, of course, when you look at the sort of outcomes and the stats, it's very clear that he's not a consistent attacker, and that's fine, right? The reality is he does play Albania. For me, he's a bit more of a short-term punt. He is someone that has man of the match potential, though, because I think when you talk about his ability to maybe dominate a game, I do think that there is that sort of propensity for Barella to do that. So I think that's quite nice for Barella. With Kvaratskhelia, as I said, I think he's a main talisman for Georgia, but I do think that they're unfortunately one of the worst teams within this group here. What is nice about Kvaratskhelia, though, is that we've seen Georgia at least capable of being able to score within some of their qualifier games and some of their friendly games too, and that he's been very involved regardless, right? Penalty taker as well. So for me, because the fact that Turkey is the first game and then Czech Republic is the second game, that's very nice for a Kvaratskhelia, because you could actually consider him as a short punt. And then, of course, if you plan to use a chip on match day 3, you can completely forget about that Portuguese fixture. So for me, he's an interesting punt for a different reason. And ultimately, you just have to have a little bit more faith, I suppose, in Georgia being able to, score against the odds. As far as Mudryk and Sane, I think I'm not too interested in them. To be fair, Mudryk, I would say, is also very involved, right? A much more key player for the Ukrainian national team than his role for Chelsea. And that's good. But of course, we expect for the Ukrainian team to struggle a little bit more. Similar to Kvaratskhelia, I do think that he is someone who has really good fixtures on match day 1, match day 2. But once again, I think he's less important to the team, and probably you'll see that someone like Dovbyk is a little bit more interesting as a pick to go for. So I'd probably pass on someone like Mudryk if I was to go for, let's say, a Ukrainian punt within my team. With Sane, I think there's an asterisk here, and it's very clear, right? In my opinion, Sane is not part of the starting 11 for this German national team. However, of course, if an injury happens, or if suddenly Nagelsmann changes his mind and the setup that he's been going with recently is something that he's planning to change, and we can see that in the friendlies, maybe we'll see Sane start. At the same time, the asterisk is here to remind you guys that by the deadline, you'll actually find out what the German lineup will be. And so, of course, if Sane starts, he becomes immediately, in my opinion, something like a green pick, because he's just that explosive of a player and that interesting, considering the fixture is actually really good for match day 1. Otherwise, I think he's going to come off the bench, and that's not very good. As far as the 7.5 tier, sort of opposite argumentation here for words, right? I wouldn't necessarily say he's naturally as explosive as Sane, but obviously he's an extremely creative player, one of the better players from an attacking point of view within Europe, and particularly the Bundesliga this season. I think it's very clear that Nagelsmann does rate him, and that his minutes have become secure within this German national team setup. So I do like Wirtz quite a lot. I think that he's a very great player, and potentially, of course, someone that can fly into my draft as long as I can afford that sort of 7.5 million price bracket. And once again, we should get the lineup for Germany. With Olmo, I think that he should start for Spain. As a Spaniard, I'd expect him to probably play that 10 role and reassume the same role that he played when he was actually against the Brazilian national team. And he, of course, had a brilliant game there. What's nice about Olmo is that despite sort of struggling, unfortunately, to stay fit within the domestic league campaigns for whatever reason with Leipzig, he has actually always been a key player for the Spanish team. So I do think that Olmo should start. However, I'm not 100% about it. I'd say more 90-95%. However, we do have some tough games, right? So that's the thing that's sort of drawing me back to Olmo a little bit less. Ultimately, Croatia, Italy, those are tougher games. And then Spain's best game is on match day 3. So because a lot of people are planning to potentially use a chip on match day 3, I think Olmo's value is a little bit worse. You have to sort of really believe that the Spanish national team is going to do really well. And I'd apply the same logic to Modric as well. Someone who's obviously not an attacker, but someone who completely controls the game for Croatia. Man of the match potential is there, particularly if Croatia do well. Although, of course, the best game is in match day 2. So whether you want Modric for match day 1, I think is not so interesting to me. At 7.5, I think that's a little bit steep, considering he's also a bit more of just a defensive sort of centre mid. Not a defensive centre mid, sorry, but someone who's obviously just going to control the game, potentially drop deep as well, so that he can control the ball and distribute as well, as opposed to, for example, someone who's sort of just staying within attacking pockets. So that's unfortunately why I don't really like Modric too much, just because Spain as well, it's probably the toughest fixture that they have, and it's match day 1. Palmer, I don't think he's going to start for England. I might be wrong. We'll see in the friendlies, but I just avoid him for now. In the 8 million price point to 8.5, because unfortunately Trossard's the only interesting 8 million player. I think Trossard and Saka are very interesting, right? Trossard, we've seen, is one of the most efficient players when it comes to finishing within limited minutes. Here, with Belgium, with easier fixtures, I think the nice thing that you can argue for Trossard is that his minutes should be very good for this Belgium team, and that's a very interesting prospect, right? So that's why I think Trossard is so good. When you compare it to Saka as well, I think he's been always an instrumental player for this English team. They're a very dominant team, and we do expect them to be dominant in this tournament. I do think his minutes should be very strong too. When we look at international games and we look at the quality of defense, we tend to say that it's actually worse than domestic league games. So I think the ability for Saka to, for example, really play with his defenders and actually completely create chances, even, for example, like when he was playing versus France, a team that we hold to a high regard and a high standard, you can see Saka is a very dominant player. And as long as he's fit, which is obviously a small question mark given the fact that he did end the season not playing for Arsenal in game week 38, is something to think about. But otherwise, I think Saka is just an amazing pick, and therefore a green pick as well. With Bernardo Silva, less interested in him, although I think you can always make the argument that, as I said with Vitinha, if you're part of an attacking team, probably going to dominate most of their opponents, and you're involved in the actions, I think you're always going to be a decent pick. However, he is 8.5 million, which I think is a little bit steep. And I think when you compare it to Bruno, is the 1 million price point that is between Bernardo Silva and Bruno something that you should sort of spend to get the better player from a sort of goals and assists perspective, from a sort of man of the match perspective as well? I do think so, right? So I think Bruno is a much more key player to this Portuguese team. He also plays in a much more attacking role, as opposed to at times at United when you can see him basically play as a center back, which even Onana mentioned in an interview recently. So that for me is the main difference. Obviously, Bernardo Silva too plays a little bit more of an advanced role at times. He doesn't, for example, play left back for Man City, which he did, for example, last season. And of course, with Portugal, you're seeing a much more consistent attacking role. As I said, though, I just prefer other players within the Portuguese setup, and I do prefer, for example, Cristiano and Bruno if I'm ever going to spend that much money on a Portuguese player. So unfortunately, that's why I'm not too high on Bernardo Silva. As far as the sort of main tier of players, the sort of premiums, and I've clubbed them together in the 9 million to 9.5 million price point, I do think you're really talking about all the players here and how whether you can actually afford them based on how much money you're going to spend on the forwards, right? As I said and alluded to at the beginning there, I think one of my concerns is, whether you go for someone like Lukaku, who's expensive, on top of, let's say, the more standard template, which is going to be Kane and Mbappe, or, of course, you spend that sort of money and not go for Lukaku, you maybe go for another forward who could be interesting, like a Havertz, like a Chiesa, maybe a Yamal even, or a Dovbyk, and then you actually go for the more expensive midfielder. Because we have so many enablers in this game, I do think that it's possible to maybe achieve both, right? If you, let's say, go for someone like Jorginho, that frees you up to potentially go one player in Bruno and then one player in someone like Lukaku in the forward position. However, just quickly just looking at the players once again, just reassessing, I do think that one of these players are worth to sort of jam in your team. Would I go for two of them? Probably not. As I said, I prefer someone like Lukaku as well, on top of like maybe double stacking a Fernandes and Foden. If I was to actually rate the players individually, though, and start from the top, De Bruyne, I think, is of course, he's got all the intangibles bar penalties. So that's a very nice thing for this Belgium team. And, of course, the fixtures are a lot nicer this time around. Although we can argue the same when they, for example, played Canada in the World Cup and didn't really deliver. I still think the squad is a little bit better. Defense is still probably a bit poor, and you can't expect too much from the Belgian team. But they've been pretty solid recently. Some good results as well built up in the friendlies and the recent campaigns that they've had. So I do think De Bruyne is once again going to be that talismanic player outside of Lukaku. I think a lot of people don't like Lukaku, of course, just watching him domestically. But when you look at international campaigns, when you look at qualifying campaigns for Belgium, particularly when they have easier fixtures, which is on display here for the group stages, Lukaku is always probably the player that you'd want to go for on top of De Bruyne. So I think considering that Lukaku's 9 million, De Bruyne's 9.5, I'd probably still go for Lukaku at this point in time over De Bruyne if I was really to choose between the two. As far as Bellingham, I do think that his role within the national team hasn't really been solidified yet, the same way that he kind of has a free role for Real Madrid. At times, though, I'll also mention that I think a lot of the sort of Bellingham playing purely as a 10 narrative is a little bit overplayed. He does play and sort of even take the ball from deep positions for Real Madrid at times, and at games you'll see he does carry the ball from deep as well. For me, Bellingham, as I said, hasn't really asserted himself within the national team the same way that you'd expect for him to have done, given the sort of role that he's been given at Real Madrid and within a very top team. But I still think that he's probably a tier below for me, and I'd still really have to see, for example, Bellingham fully click within the national team for me to really make that sort of leap of judgment. Because even though he might be one of the best players in the world, do I think he's one of the best fantasy assets for Euro 2024 Matchday 1? Not necessarily, which is why I'm going to put him in a tier 2 bracket here. Fernandes and Foden, though, I'm a little bit more confident about that because I think with Foden, for example, you can argue that he's most likely going to play an attacking position. Bellingham could arguably play a little bit deeper at times, and that is going to be a little bit of a detriment as well. Plus, he's also a bit more expensive. As far as Fernandes, as I said, even if, let's say, you see Cristiano Ronaldo as an early substitute, that's actually something that just enables Fernandes even more, right? You're looking at him being the penalty taker if Cristiano Ronaldo is off the field, and that's really nice. And also, when you see his role with Portugal, I have to be honest and say that he just shows how amazing he is as a player, and I think that's always really brilliant to see, and why I really do like Bruno from an international fantasy perspective. If you look at, for example, even the previous World Cup campaign, very key player for this Portuguese team, even if Ronaldo is present within the team. So I think the idea that he's just a creator and someone who plays extremely deep is definitely overblown, particularly when you've watched him play for Portugal. And that's it. That's going to be the cheat sheet for the midfield. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. We'll obviously update our sort of cheat sheet as we head towards the end of the tournament. What I'll be releasing is the forwards video next, and then the defenders video. And then after a few more friendlies, we'll probably change the cheat sheet and produce to you guys a final cheat sheet for match day 1 ready for the deadline. So thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys soon. Take care and goodbye.